They say the fire began just after midnight. The guests had retired, the candles were low, and a storm moved quietly over the Wiltshire hills. Yet inside Clarendon Hall, music still played, faint, unbroken, defying the hour and the rising smoke. When rescuers arrived at dawn, they found nothing but ash and marble foundations. But among the ruin, one thing stood untouched. The ballroom floor, scorched but intact, its blackened boards marked by two perfect footprints, small, delicate, and surrounded by a faint ring of melted candle wax. It was there, the witnesses said, that she danced. Clarendon Hall had always seemed too grand for its valley. Built of pale stone and ringed by forest, it stood as a relic of England's fading aristocracy, proud, decaying, and whispering of fortunes long lost. In the spring of 1880, however, it bloomed back to life for one last celebration. Lord Arthur Pembroke, heir to a family of traders turned noblemen, had announced his engagement to Lady Eleanor Wren, the youngest daughter of the late Sir Alistair Wren of Bath. She was known in society for her delicate charm and unearthly composure, the kind of beauty that seemed to belong to another time. The papers called it the wedding of the season. Invitations gilded in silver were sent across London. Carriages arrived from as far as Devon and Sussex. Musicians from Vienna were hired to play through the night. And at the centre of it all stood Clarendon Hall, newly restored, its chandeliers polished, its walls repapered in crimson and gold. The place was alive again, for the first time in decades. The ceremony itself passed without incident. The guests described it as elegant, though strangely subdued. The bride spoke her vows in a whisper that forced the vicar to lean closer. When she lifted her veil, her face was pale. Not from fear, it seemed, but from exhaustion. Like a ghost, one guest wrote later, beautiful, but not of this world. By evening, the celebration had grown more animated. The orchestra played waltzes and mazurkas, and the scent of lilac filled the ballroom. Yet a sense of unease threaded through the joy, a tremor that no one could name. A servant tripped, carrying a tray of glasses, cutting his hand on the shards. A mirror above the fireplace cracked without cause, splitting the reflection of the dance floor in two. And when the bride passed beneath it, the candles flickered, all of them at once. At 11:30, the storm arrived. Rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled over the hills. Still, the dancing continued. The bride moved gracefully, her gown sweeping across the marble like a shadow. Several guests remarked that she seemed tireless, her steps unbroken, her gaze distant. Her husband watched her from the edge of the floor, smiling nervously, but she never looked back. When midnight struck, the orchestra began the final waltz, a melody written specially for her, titled The Clarendon Vow. The guests later said it was a haunting tune, slow and strangely mournful. It rose and fell like breathing, and as the music played, the storm outside seemed to mimic its rhythm. Then, a flash of light, a scream, the scent of smoke. A candelabrum had fallen from the upper balcony, igniting the drapes. Panic spread instantly. Servants rushed to open doors, only to find the handles burning hot. Flames climbed the walls with impossible speed, swallowing the gilded wallpaper, then the ceiling, then the air itself. In the chaos, no one saw the bride leave the ballroom. Some said she was carried away by her husband. Others claimed she remained, still dancing, as the fire consumed the hall. When the flames died and the search began, no trace of Lady Eleanor was ever found. Not her gown, not her jewels, not even ash. But one maid, half-blind from smoke, swore she saw the bride standing in the center of the burning room, her veil alight, and her arms raised as though guiding the flames in time with the music. She was smiling, the maid said later, and she kept dancing even when the floor began to fall. By morning, the great house was gone. Only the ballroom floor remained, blackened and hollow, with two faint footprints scorched into the wood. and though the storm had long passed, the air still smelled faintly of roses. For weeks after, those who passed the ruins at night claimed they could still hear music, soft, distant, and accompanied by the faint rhythm of a waltz, one that seemed to echo not from the halls, but from beneath the ground. The fire at Clarendon Hall burned for nearly 6 hours. By the time it was extinguished, little remained but stone and soot. 37 guests were unaccounted for. 12 were later identified by personal effects. But one name, Lady Eleanor Pembroke, never appeared among them. Her disappearance gave birth to the legend. Some said she escaped, others that she perished in the flames, and a few whispered something far more unsettling, that she never left the ballroom at all. In the weeks that followed, the tragedy became a spectacle. Newspapers across England printed conflicting accounts, each more elaborate than the last. "Bride vanishes in inferno," read one. "Woman seen dancing among the flames," said another. The servants who survived were interrogated repeatedly. Most described chaos and confusion, but 3 of them, all young maids, told the same peculiar story. They heard the music long after everyone else had fled. One of them, Mary Cottrell, gave her statement to the coroner in plain, trembling handwriting. "We ran for the door. My ears were ringing. Then I heard the violin, still playing. I turned back and saw her in the middle of the room. Her dress was burning, but she wasn't screaming. She was smiling." Another maid, Anna Rowe, added that she thought she saw Lord Pembroke on the floor near the doorway, unconscious, and that Lady Eleanor stepped over him without pause, still turning, still keeping time with the music. When rescuers found the groom's body, his hands were burned, but his face was untouched, peaceful, almost content. The coroner wrote only 2 words beside his name: "Cause unknown." Then came the letters. Among the recovered belongings from the servants' quarters was a small bundle wrapped in lace, a series of letters written by Lady Eleanor to her maid in the week before the wedding. They were never sent, but each was carefully folded, sealed, and placed in order. The first spoke of sleepless nights, of strange noises from the east wing where the ballroom stood. "The walls hum when I pass them," she wrote, "as though they are waiting to echo me." The second described dreams, vivid, impossible dreams of dancing alone beneath the chandeliers, her gown wet and heavy, her feet moving in rhythm with something she could not see. "It isn't music," she wrote, "it's breathing." And the third, written the night before the ceremony, simply said, "He promised me eternity, and I accepted." No one ever discovered who he referred to. The inquest that followed ruled the fire accidental, the result of a fallen candelabrum. But not everyone agreed. Reverend Simon Graves, the local vicar who had presided over the ceremony, submitted a report of his own to the diocese, now preserved in the Wiltshire archives. In it, he describes the moments before the vows. "When I spoke the final blessing, Lady Pembroke did not repeat after me. Instead, she whispered something under her breath, a phrase I could not make out. Her lips moved in rhythm with the music, though no music was playing. I felt a coldness in the air that did not belong to the season." He ended the report with a sentence that was later crossed out in ink, but still faintly visible beneath. "The union was not between 2 souls, but between life and something beyond it." Weeks turned to months, and Clarendon Hall remained deserted. The ruins cooled, but the stories burned hotter than ever. A farmer's son claimed to see a figure dancing in the reflection of the pond near the property. A postman passing the grounds at dawn swore he heard the faint echo of a waltz. Slow and graceful, like the heartbeat of something sleeping, and though no body was ever recovered, one peculiar item was found near the foundation, a silver pendant warped by heat. Inside it, beneath the soot, was a lock of red hair and a scrap of parchment with the words, "When the fire comes, I will be free." The press eventually tired of the story, but the locals never did. For years afterward, every time lightning struck near the ruins, they said it was her, the bride of Clarendon Hall, dancing again in her gown of smoke, keeping her promise to the fire that took her. And for those who listened closely, There was always that same refrain, a single violin bowing through the wind, keeping time with a rhythm that should have died with her. But in 1881, exactly 1 year after the wedding, something changed. The new owners of the estate, the Hargraves family, began the process of rebuilding the West Wing. During excavation, a worker uncovered a section of floor untouched by the blaze, and beneath it, the remains of a human hand, still clutching a piece of sheet music. The title written at the top read, "The Clarendon Vow, for two to dance." By the summer of 1881, Clarendon Hall stood as little more than a skeleton. The once gilded arches were black with soot, the great marble staircase cracked and veined. Grass grew through the ballroom floor, and the wind moved freely where ceilings had once glimmered with chandeliers. But beneath that ruin, something remained alive, not in body but in rumor. Those who rebuilt the estate began to speak in whispers. Hammers slipped from hands. Nails bent without reason. Horses refused to approach the property after dusk. And every night, without fail, someone heard it. The faint echo of a violin carried through the empty hall. It always played the same melody, slow, mournful, and unfinished. The discovery of the burnt hand clutching sheet music should have been the end of the matter, a tragic coincidence. But when the music was examined more closely, something caught the attention of an inspector named Thomas Fenn, who had served as a musician before joining the constabulary. He noticed that the composition wasn't simply a waltz. The notes were arranged in repeating triads that mirrored the ancient Latin liturgy for marriage, the call and response of a vow. The title, "The Clarendon Vow, for two to dance," suddenly took on a different meaning. It was, in a sense, a ceremony written into sound, digging deeper. Fenn traced the piece to its composer, Alaric Vale, a reclusive musician who had been hired by Lord Pembroke to create an original score for the wedding. Vale lived in Bath and was known for his unconventional methods. He often composed by candlelight in complete silence, claiming to listen to the air itself. When Fenn visited his home, he found the windows shuttered and the rooms filled with sheets of music scrawled in overlapping ink. Vale himself was dead, though not recently. His death certificate dated 2 weeks before the Clarendon wedding. Among his belongings lay a journal, its last entries half burned but legible enough to read, "She came to me 3 nights before I died. She asked that I compose a piece not of joy but of union, one that would bind the living to the eternal. She said it must last beyond the heart's final beat." Another entry, written in a shaking hand, simply read, "She promised me I would hear it one last time." The journal reignited public fascination with the tragedy. Was Lady Eleanor's wedding waltz more than a song? Had she commissioned it not for celebration, but for something darker, a ritual disguised in melody? Newspapers reframed the story as a haunting. The Bath Chronicle wrote, "The bride who danced beyond death, a wedding waltz that never ceased." But the church refused to reopen the investigation, dismissing it as superstition. Even so, the letters continued to surface. Correspondences between Eleanor and her childhood governess, recovered from a cousin's estate. In one, written 2 months before the wedding, Eleanor confides, "The veil is not to conceal the bride, but to protect her from what watches as she dances." And in another, "When the vow is spoken in music, the fire will not destroy, only renew." Inspector Fenn's notes, preserved in the county archives, end abruptly in October 1881. His last entry reads, "The tune has changed." It plays in reverse. He was found 2 days later, drowned in the pond near the estate. The violin he kept from the ruins lay beside him. Its strings snapped. After his death, work at Clarendon Hall stopped completely. The Hargraves family abandoned their reconstruction, and the estate was sealed by court order. It would remain untouched for nearly 30 years, but the story did not die. In the early 1900s, during a lecture on musical symbolism at King's College, a professor named Dr. Edmund Sykes presented a strange recording, a phonograph cylinder discovered in a private collection. The recording was faint, filled with static and distant hum, but the melody was unmistakable, the Clarendon Vow. Halfway through, the tempo shifted. The violins fell silent, and then, in the background, a woman's voice, almost inaudible, humming the tune where the instruments had stopped. Sykes ended his lecture with a single note of commentary. If this voice is truly captured from the air itself, then perhaps some vows cannot be broken, not even by death. In the years that followed, the melody spread quietly through Europe, whispered about among composers, played in secret by pianists seeking inspiration, and banned from certain churches for the unease it caused. They said those who played the Clarendon Vow to its final bar would see her, the bride in her gown of ash, dancing where the air grew thick and the light refused to stay. For nearly 3 decades, Clarendon Hall slept beneath ivy and rain. The countryside reclaimed it. The gardens turned to wild meadow, the ballroom to a hollow of broken beams and moss. Locals avoided the valley entirely. Travellers passing on horseback described a stillness there, a silence so dense it muffled even the wind. But in 1902, the silence broke. A London industrialist named Henry Latham purchased the estate, intending to restore it as a retreat for artists and scholars. He was a practical man, unimpressed by superstition, and saw only opportunity in the ruins. His wife Clara, however, was fascinated by the legend. She encouraged him to keep the ballroom intact, to rebuild it exactly as it had stood before the fire. For months, craftsmen toiled under her supervision. Every detail was reconstructed: the gilded arches, the carved oak panels, even the marble tiles. The original floorboards, blackened but still solid, were polished back to their pale sheen and laid in their old pattern. When the work was finished, the ballroom looked exactly as it had in 1880, except for one thing. There was a mirror missing. According to the old blueprints, a grand mirror had once hung at the end of the hall, facing the dance floor. It was said to have shattered during the fire, but one of the workers discovered something extraordinary buried beneath the debris, a shard nearly 2 feet high, perfectly preserved within the rubble. Mrs. Latham insisted it be restored and mounted once more. The workers were reluctant, but they obeyed. When they hung the fragment in its frame, they found that it distorted reflections in peculiar ways. Figures appeared slightly closer than they were. Faces blurred at the edges. On the evening of its installation, Mrs. Latham hosted a small gathering. 10 guests, 2 musicians, and a photographer. They dined, they drank, and eventually someone suggested they play the Clarendon Vow. The musicians hesitated. They had heard the stories. But she insisted. The first bars of the melody were slow and fragile. The guests smiled politely, though none seemed at ease. Then, as the final refrain began, the air turned colder. The lamps flickered, and in the mirror, only in the mirror, a faint shimmer appeared. At first it looked like candlelight bending, then like movement. The reflection of the floor showed a figure that wasn't there in the room. The outline of a woman, pale, turning slowly in time with the music. One guest gasped and dropped his glass. Another fainted outright, but Mrs. Latham remained still, transfixed. The figure's gown was colorless, flowing, and seemed to trail smoke. When the music stopped, the mirror went black. The figure vanished. The photographer, shaken, developed his plate the next morning. The image showed the ballroom perfectly lit, empty of people, except for one shape, faint and blurred, standing where the reflection had been. A woman, caught mid-turn, her face indistinct, her posture elegant. The photograph was later misplaced. Some say Mrs. Latham destroyed it. Others say it was stolen. After that night, the new Clarendon Hall never knew peace. Doors opened on their own. Guests awoke to the sound of distant waltzes. Servants complained of seeing a woman's silhouette in the hallways, always near mirrors, always watching. One maid resigned after seeing her own reflection move while she stood still. Another claimed to hear breathing behind her as she polished the glass. Mr. Latham dismissed it all as hysteria, until the night he held a private party for musicians from London. They played the piece again. This time something joined in, not visibly but audibly, a faint hum, female, perfectly pitched to the melody. The musicians stopped, but the hum continued, fading only when the candles were snuffed out. Latham ordered the mirror covered the next morning. In 1904, 2 years after the restoration, the house was abandoned. The Lathams left quietly, leaving their furniture, instruments, even clothes. No one ever heard from them again. When caretakers entered the property weeks later, they found everything undisturbed except the ballroom. The cover over the mirror had been torn away. The surface was cracked from top to bottom, as if struck from within. On the floor below, it lay a single object, a silver pendant, half melted, containing a lock of red hair. The hall remained sealed for decades. It became a destination for thrill-seekers and researchers, all hoping to glimpse the Bride of Clarendon. Among them was Professor Lionel Grace, an early paranormal investigator who studied acoustic phenomena. In 1925, he conducted what he called the mirror experiment. Using newly developed phonographs, he recorded the ambient sound in the ballroom while playing the Clarendon Vow on a gramophone. The results were inexplicable. At precisely midnight, every recording needle stopped moving, frozen mid-rotation. Yet when replayed, the wax cylinders emitted faint, rhythmic sounds that hadn't been heard during the experiment. The shuffle of fabric, a heartbeat-like thump, and beneath it all, the soft glide of footsteps. The footsteps circled the room exactly 3 times. Then a woman's voice, quiet, almost affectionate, whispered, "Keep dancing." Professor Grace's notes ended abruptly. He left the field entirely, spending the rest of his life in seclusion. The wax cylinders were stored in the British Library, but have since gone missing. Clarendon Hall was once again abandoned. The mirrors were removed, the ballroom sealed. But locals say that even now, when moonlight hits the valley just right, the hill where the house once stood reflects faint light, as if a hidden surface beneath the soil were catching it, turning it, moving in rhythm with something unseen, a dance perhaps, or the echo of one. By 1930, Clarendon Hall had outlived every generation that once feared it. It was no longer a house, only a memory held together by ivy and stories. The ballroom's great windows were shattered, its walls invaded by moss and birds. But the legends endured. No one in Wiltshire would step within a mile of it after dark. That year, a London philanthropist named Margaret Lisle purchased the estate with plans to demolish the ruins and build a hospital. She dismissed the stories as provincial superstition. But before construction could begin, she sent a small restoration crew to catalogue what remained. They arrived in October, 4 men and a woman, armed with lanterns, notebooks, and a single gramophone to test the hall's acoustics. On their first night, they reported the structure surprisingly stable. The ballroom, though charred and silent, seemed untouched by decay. One of the men described it as frozen in time. Another wrote in his diary, "The air here feels like waiting, as if the house expects something." 2 nights later, the team decided to make a test recording for posterity to capture the hall's natural resonance. They placed the gramophone in the center of the ballroom, wound the cylinder, and began to play the only surviving copy of the Clarendon Vow. What happened next was never fully explained. Halfway through the melody, every lantern flickered out. The temperature dropped. The wax cylinder kept turning, but the music faltered, as though the air itself had thickened around it. Then faintly another sound rose beneath the waltz, the shuffle of skirts, the soft slide of feet across wood. One of the crew, the woman, began to cry. She said later that she saw movement, not in the darkness, but reflected in the cracked window pane. A pale figure turning slowly, her gown rippling like smoke. The gramophone continued to play, though the handle had stopped turning. The melody looped endlessly, repeating its final refrain, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the same rhythm, the same vow. When dawn broke, the crew was gone. Only the gramophone remained, still spinning, its cylinder etched beyond recognition. The housekeeper who found it claimed to hear laughter coming from inside the device, faint, distant, and oddly joyful. 3 weeks later, Clarendon Hall burned again. There was no lightning, no storm, no explanation. Witnesses from nearby villages said the fire rose from within, a column of orange and gold that lit the valley like sunrise. When it finally died, not a single stone stood upright. The ballroom, once again, was the center of the ruin. At its core, buried beneath ash, was a patch of unburned wood, smooth, circular, and marked by 2 sets of footprints, one small, one larger, both perfectly aligned. In 1974, a team of archivists revisiting the Clarendon files discovered something remarkable, a recording mislabeled in the British Library's collection. The label read only Wiltshire, 1904, recovered. When played, the recording was little more than static until minute 3. There, beneath the hiss, came the faint sound of a piano, then a violin, then a woman humming, and just before the cylinder ended, a voice, clear, close, and impossibly alive, whispered, "You kept your promise." Experts dismissed it as interference, an audio artifact. But those who heard it in person swore the melody that followed matched the Clarendon Vow exactly, a song never officially recorded, known only through fragments of sheet music lost to the fire. Today, nothing remains of Clarendon Hall. The land is overgrown, the valley reclaimed by nature. But travelers still report strange echoes there, faint music carried by the wind, a fragrance of roses in the cold air, and at times the sensation of warmth, like standing too close to a fire that isn't there. Local folklore calls her the Bride of Ash, and they say she still dances when the moon is full, not in grief, not in rage, but in the joy of a vow never broken. One witness, an old shepherd, described it best. It isn't haunting, it's remembering. In the archives of the Wiltshire Historical Society, a single object is kept under glass, a fragment of mirror, blackened at its edges. If you lean close enough, you can still see your reflection, faint and warped. But on certain nights, when the light hits it just right, another face appears beside yours. A woman's, pale, serene, waiting, and if you listen carefully, you'll hear the faint rhythm that has never ceased. A violin bow gliding over strings, the echo of 2 sets of footsteps. The waltz that binds the living to the eternal, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, forever in time.